CEO of Nigeria's sovereign authority says Nigeria's sovereign wealth fund has grown to $2 billion. We're going to discuss this and more stories making the rounds in West Africa at this time with my guest host, Tilewa Adebajo, CEO at the CFG Advisory. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, those are the top stories making the rounds still, but what is your top story this week?
Well, the top story, I think, clearly is the fact that Nigeria is out of recession. But I think it's important that we temper the expectations, because the analogy I'll use is the fact that the Nigerian economy has been in intensive care. So these figures just indicate that the economy has now come out of a coma, but has not yet reached the recovery room. In order for the economy, the Nigerian economy, to get to the recovery room, then the economy must be growing more than the 3% rate of our population growth. That's very important. And inflation has to come down to at least 10 to 11% at the minimum, preferably single digits. After that point in the recovery room, by the time we begin to see growth of about 5%, then we can begin to say we're out of the woods and the Nigerian economy can't be discharged from the hospital. So we still have a long way to go, and we need to be very careful.
But in all honesty, how soon do you see this happening? I mean, I remember talking to someone last year, and he did say, even if it's just 0.1% growth that we actually record this year, that is commendable, talking about where we're coming from. Now, you're talking about growing 3 times more, rather, compared to the population.
Yes, because if your population is growing at 3%, if you're not growing at least at 3%, then you are not doing anything. But do you really see
that happening anytime soon? Let's just be very real right now with what we have on ground.
That's what I'm trying to say, because what you need to look at is what are the factors that are going to influence that growth. The stimulus from the government is not coming through. Inflation is too high at 16.5% to stimulate growth and to lower interest rates. So we need to get inflation down, get the interest rates down to be able to stimulate the economy and get confidence there. So we're still looking at a recovery period of about a year or two to get to that levels. And if you look at the World Bank projections, or even the IMF projections, or even the rating agency projections, but before we get to 5% growth, some are even looking at 3 years' time. So it's important that we sustain growth higher than the level of our population. And that's why I say we're still in intensive care, but we're out of the coma. So we need to get to the recovery room, and that is when you're growing faster than your population, then you can get into recovery mode.
But in talking about our population growth,
yes,
now that's a subject we hardly touch on. Yes. But it's really key, though, to achieve development. I know I did mention this yesterday as well. While it might seem a bit difficult to reach, the target that you are placing here, how can we begin to talk about population control?
Population control is important, but it's also important that you have strong economic policies, and it's a cause and effect. The interplay between interest rates, inflation, and GDP growth is very clear. There's a very high correlation between all those 3 factors. And if your inflation rate is at 16%, for this economy, you're not going to get the desired rate of growth. This economy has the potential to grow at 10% per annum. But we don't have the right stimulus, and we don't have the right policies to stimulate that growth. So if you're not doing that, then the issue of population control begins to come into play. Places like China and India have focused on, very stringent population controls to be able to at least see some impact on the growth of their economies. Now that China has achieved those significant growth, they have relaxed all their population controls, and that is something that we also need to be able to take a look at here, because it is a viable economic policy of population control.
I'm not sure we're really going to go about that. It's a very touchy subject for most people.
Yeah, it is, but it's the reality.
Something that really has to be done. But let's move over to something that actually might make us smile a bit. Now, talking about the fact that Nigeria's Sovereign Wealth Fund has grown by $2 billion. What do you make of this news?
Well, if you take a look at the GDP of this country, it's about $500 billion. And you have a sovereign wealth fund, which is, what, $2 billion? Norway has a population of 5 million people, produces about the same amount of oil that we have. And, the sovereign wealth fund is probably about, 900 billion. So let's not go about the sovereign wealth fund. We haven't funded our sovereign wealth fund. We haven't had a savings culture. At the time when we had a surplus, instead of putting that money into the sovereign wealth fund, the government of the day and the governors. Some governors actually went to court to prevent the government of the day from putting money into the sovereign wealth fund. We went to court to say we don't want to save. So that is why we find our sovereign wealth fund not where it's supposed to be. So the government needs to be able to.
But then the governors kind of had a reason for saying that. According to them, they couldn't get a clear explanation for what the money was being used for. But we're seeing the effect of that.
Yes, but you invest. A sovereign wealth fund is clear as to
what I'm actually smiling at the moment is, look, anything right now that's an addition in whatever way, I think is just a welcome development here. I mean, last year was a nightmare. But when you talk about this savings culture, really, do you think we're doing better today? And why do you think it was so difficult for us to really save in the past? I mean, it was really simple, though. You see, we can't argue, we can't make an argument on trying to put something away for a rainy day. Yes.
The last financial crisis, global financial crisis, the reason why Nigeria survived was because we had close to $16 billion in the excess crude account. So a lot of people complain that this excess crude account was not really a structured process, and that was why the Sovereign Wealth Fund was created. If at the point in time the Sovereign Wealth Fund started, we had funded it with about $10 billion, we're not going to be talking about what we're talking about today. There will be some amount of stabilization funds. At least the Sovereign Wealth Fund could have provided to the governors when they didn't have money to pay salaries, when the reserves were coming down. So the sort of crisis that we went to, your Sovereign Wealth Fund provides you this buffer. It happened before in the past.
Yeah. Now, we have this sort of story here talking about, 11 discos rejecting electricity from Gencos. I mean, the word reject electricity, that's a first.
Well, it's headline news, and I think it's sensationalism, and let's look at the facts. Clearly, what's happening now is the fact that we're generating more electricity in Nigeria, but unfortunately, the transmission grid and the distribution grid does not have the capacity to absorb that generation. So that is the challenge we have now, that investments now need to go not only into the transmission infrastructure, but also the distribution infrastructure.
I asked that question about, our transmission infrastructure. I believe that was last week. No one has given a clear answer, really, about what's playing out there. Clearly, our transmission, infrastructure cannot carry more than 4,000 megawatts, from what I hear. Many say, when you get to about over 4,000, you're actually going to have to step down, a certain power station. And I'm asking myself, generating electricity is no longer the problem right now. Transmitting electricity generated is another issue. What are we doing about this 2 years, 3 years after?
Well, that's the problem. The transmission company of Nigeria is still owned by the federal government.
That's right.
It hasn't been privatized. And I think that is really where you see the bottlenecks. And I think what the government needs to do now is to make the necessary investment in the transmission infrastructure and let the distribution companies make the investments in their distribution structures to be able to allow the power to come in. Because we've had a very good rainy season, most of the hydro plants are operating at significant capacity. Kainji Dam, for instance, is generating about 600 megawatts. But right now they have to shut down about 2 of their turbines to be able to maybe generate about 400 because the grid cannot take their capacity. So we have 200,000, we have about 500 or to close to 1,000 megawatts of electricity that we cannot put into the grid.
You can imagine the difference that little, will really make. Well, thank you so much, Tilewa. I'm talking to Tilewa Adebajo, CEO at the CFG Advisory. He's also my guest.